Well, hello, my friends. We meet again. It has been a while. Where should we begin? You asked, and you shall receive here, boys. Today, we are exploring how the mighty, legendary, and pummeling death metal band boltthrower got involved with a small little tabletops game company named Games Workshop and the legal mess which followed. So, I will be making another video listing every single Warhammer reference in boltthrower's music after this, so make sure you boys subscribe for that one if you are interested. Let's get into it first, shall we? But first, Xeno's checkpoint. If you are not fully devoted to the service of the Emperor, you may not pass. If you betray this order, you shall face judgment by the nearest commissar. Proceed with caution. Now, I'm both a big Warhammer 40k and boltthrower fan, so this is kind of a dream come true, and I love that I get to nerd out here with you guys, so yeah, I love it. Boltthrower formed in 1986 when Barry Thompson and Gavin Ward, inspired after seeing a punk show, decided to make a band together. As you do, as you do. Later on, vocalist Carl Willits would actually say that the band got the band name from a copy of White Dwarf. They were flipping through White Dwarf and they saw the name. Now, White Dwarf was initially a magazine covering all sorts of tabletop games, right? Dungeons and Dragons, all that type of shit. But by the mid-80s have been transformed into more or less the Games Workshop magazine. Now, Games Workshop, if you are unaware, is the company behind the Warhammer 40k franchise, the Warhammer universe, I guess. But we'll get more to them in just a bit here, guys. So right from the get-go, the band has at least some tacit connection to Warhammer, right? Bolt throwers are basically the in-game universe name for gigantic, huge crossbow siege weapons, which we would probably call ballistas. People often think they got their name from the Warhammer 40k bolt gun, which is called the bolter or the bolt gun, but I don't really think that's the case, as, you know, Rogue Trader wasn't released until late 1987 and wasn't even previewed until like middle of 1987, and boltthrower was already a band and already had demos out by then, so they almost definitely got the name from Warhammer Fantasy. But now we're reaching like real nerd levels here, real nerd hours here, boys. But you know, I just had to clear the air. Regardless, the connection was already there. Boltthrower would play some live shows, they would settle on a stable lineup, and release a few demos, which then drew the attention of Andrew Peel from the BBC. This was enough to get them signed, and in 1988, their first album, In Battle There Is No Law, was released, which is like a pure kind of straight grindcore album. And if you look at the name of the artwork, its songs, and the lyrics, it actually has little or nothing at all to do with Warhammer. Kind of interesting. However, then it was later on in 1989 when things began to start to get a bit interesting for our story here. So you see, in 1987, Games Workshop released Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, which established the Warhammer 40k universe and started this whole thing. But before then, in 1983, Games Workshop had released Warhammer, or what a super, cool Warhammer fans like to call it, Warhammer Fantasy. I refuse to call it the Old World or Age of Sigmar. It's Warhammer Fantasy. Now, Games Workshop had been growing both in size, scope, and cultural influence by the end of the 80s, and was actually looking to expand itself into other endeavors. Now, Warhammer 40k wasn't simply, Warhammer, but in space, but rather featured some really, really cool and innovative concepts in science fiction. Rather than painting the future of mankind as some sort of like clean technological utopia, with political intrigues causing that, instead painted the future as grimy, incredibly violent, industrial, dystopian, and perhaps most of all, grim dark, right? The dying remains of mankind's greatest empire, destroyed not by some alien race or some incredibly powerful technology, instead torn apart by hubris, greed, and betrayal. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, then I really have no idea why you would click on this video in the first place. But if you haven't, please go check out the channel Lutien09 and get the best lore ever injected directly into your ear canals. Now, thus, Warhammer 40k had a completely different vibe than most other tabletop games, obviously inspired by the industrialization and then decay of England, as well as like the calamity and destruction of the Second 30 Years' War. It was just much, much, much darker than everything else going around at the time. And I just love the Warhammer 40k universe, where there's so many themes of like human greed, suffering. Humans are sort of like the wave race, with the wave tactic race, right? Psychers, defense against AI, relegating AI, having wars over it. Pretty crazy stuff. Now, Games Workshop is looking to expand their businesses. They would they'd begin to look around, and then they would look at the burgeoning music scenes, death metal and grindcore, which would feature similar dark and violent themes. They would continue to expand the lore and universe with subsequent expansions and White Dwarf articles, including one which would lend the name to the Bolt Thrower band, Realm of Chaos, but more on that shortly. Now, Games Workshop by 1989 had been eyeing up the music industry and even had dipped their toes into it some years before, when in 1987, thrash band Sabbath teamed up with Games Workshop for one single which would come packaged in copies of White Dwarf. The single, Blood for the Blood God, would be the company's first sort of foray into the music industry, which, as a side note, the entire story of Warhammer Records is pretty unhinged. So, guys, let me know if you'd be interested in that video down in the comments, and while you're there, make sure you like that video too, boys. Okay, back to the story. After the release of their first album here, Bolt Thrower would release another Peel BBC Sessions, and it was this copy, this Sessions, that would find its way into Games Workshop's management, specifically Andy Jones and Brian Ansell. They heard the album, liked it. Obviously, they saw the band's band name, which referenced their own game, and with this vision of sort of Games Workshop, you know, in the music business, was looking to get into some sort of relationship with this band, Bolt Thrower. Now, I think we all know that at the time, death metal and grindcore scenes in England were beginning to pop off, as well as we previously talked about Bolt Thrower in the beginning. They were also beginning to pop off as well, right? Their first album, 2 demos. So shortly after the release of their In Battle There Is No Law, and after the grind of touring, Bolt Thrower would actually be signed to Earache Records, who at the time were the biggest independent extreme music label, who signed other legendary bands such as Morbid Angel, Napalm Death, Terrorizer, and Entomb. Now, Games Workshop had been in touch with the band before they actually signed with Earache, and Gavin Ward, in an interview, would have this to say about it. Well, the management for Games Workshop got in touch with us and offered us everything. Management, stage sets, you name it. But we were also worried about going with a games company at that time who wouldn't know how to handle record sales and things like that. So we thought that we'd take advantage of the best of both worlds, but the Games Workshop deal ended up being very difficult as well when it came to things like the right to the artwork and so on and so on. It's like anything, when corporations get involved, they inevitably always get in the way, end quote. Now, don't worry, boys, we will talk about that last sentence in Gavin's quote in just a few minutes here. So, rather than sign with Games Workshop, who were obviously not actually in the music business yet, Bolt Thrower, despite the offer, chose to sign with Earache Records. A decision which in hindsight could have led the band down a completely different path, maybe even led Games Workshop down a completely different path. And I must say it was a much smarter move for them to sign with Earache, right? So in the spring of 1989, they went into the studio to record their second album. Now, in Games Workshop part, they correctly identified that metal and Warhammer have a huge overlap in fandom, probably even more so back then in the late 80s. I myself actually found out about Bolt Thrower through Warhammer 40k. I was at a Games Workshop actually buying some Eldar, and yes, I was an Eldar Chad, deal with it, when the guy behind the counter noticed my Megadeth shirt and told me about this Warhammer-themed death metal band, which of course was Bolt Thrower. Now, I am obviously not a millionaire, so I don't play, paint, or collect Warhammer anymore. It's ludicrously expensive, and I have a few friends who actually still collect and play Warhammer, both of whom also coincidentally also love metal. So back then, I don't think it was all that bad of an idea, right? You could have every camo shorts wearing death metal fan becoming a Warhammer fan and vice versa. However, the music industry and tabletop war games industries are like two completely different beasts, two completely different industries, which share little overlap in terms of actual business strategy. So I think for Bolt Thrower's sake, it was much smarter them to actually go with Earache, the guys who know the music industry, who have the contacts and stuff like that. So, you know, good foresight by the band there, I think. However, right, the guys and girl at Bolt Thrower were all legitimate Warhammer fans and didn't want to completely discard the potential connection with Games Workshop, right? That's a really, really cool opportunity. So as it goes, the offices of both Games Workshop and Earache Records were actually located pretty close to each other back then in Nottingham, England, and what may be an example of smaller companies with actual people running them, not just profit-driven demons. In some wholesome Chungus moment, they came to an agreement. Games Workshop would provide the art and lend the title of their latest expansion, which would be called Realms of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness. Bolt Thrower, on their part, would write an album with the majority of the songs and lyrics sort of revolving around the Warhammer 40k lore, which one of their most famous songs ever, right, the mighty World Eater, would lift directly from the lore. The World World Eaters being one of the Chaos Space Marine Traitor Legions, the Khorne guys, basically. So Boltthrower's album would, of course, be entitled Realms of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness. But curiously, they would not use the artwork which the book Realm of Chaos would use. Instead, they would use a cropped and adjusted version of the original OG Rogue Trader artwork, probably to avoid confusion. Which, let's just be honest here, guys, this is an insanely based piece of artwork featuring the Marines of the Crimson Fist chapter in glorious battle. Games Workshop would end up handling the entire sleeve for the LP as well, providing more of their own art. And when we look at the insides here, you can see that they actually put some real love into this. We have some Terminators fighting some Gene Stealers on some Space Hulk. I love all the little decorations and border work here. On this page, we see an insert. We have the logo for the Chaos God Khorne with some text over top of it. Khorne being the god of war, rage, and blood in this universe. This page looks like a titanic battle from the Horus Heresy with Marines fighting other Marines, with Titans blasting away in the background, possibly representing the titanic battle on Terra, which tore apart the Imperium of Man, that last climactic battle, right? You know, maybe Chaos Undivided is represented here. Then we have what appears to be some Tzeentch Lesser Demon freaks fighting some Marines, which, I mean, like, this is just some horrifying, detailed artwork here, right? Tzeentch, being the god of change, has always given me the most disturbing art and really just gives me the creeps, boys. Really incredible stuff for Games Workshop to lend to the band here. This is great art. Then we have on this page what appears to be another homage to Khorne with a bloodthirster greater demon looking all menacing and evil. Also, side note, boys, holy shit, this art is actually incredible. And beyond some minor changes to the Space Marines themselves, you really have to respect how Games Workshop absolutely nailed the aesthetic and art direction of the universe from the very, very beginning. Very, very impressive. On the next page here, we have some Nurgle Lesser Demons called Plague Bearers in the universe lore, which very fittingly are actually placed beside the lyrics for the song Plague Bearer. Banger. Nurgle being the chaos god of death, disease, decay, and rot. And on the same page just below, we have what looks to be Slaanesh Noise Marines, which are Space Marine, Chaos Space Marines dedicated to maximum stimulation at all times, just like me when I'm bed rotting, right? Slaanesh is the god of pleasures of the flesh. Very, very cool. Although it does bother me how they put Slaanesh Marines right next to the lyrics for World Eater. The World Eater are like famously Khorne's favorite legion. But I mean, like, we're on some real nerd shit, real nitpicking shit here, boys. So, sorry. Then we have some more demons of Tzeentch with these terrifying bird beak demons, lesser demons. Oh, those always just creep me out. Followed by another depiction of Nurgle demons, as well as a great unclean one, right? Which is a greater demon of Nurgle. This all ties in line with Games Workshop's 40K, and it's all just so absolutely well done, man. Absolutely legendary status here. And I mean, here we are still talking about it nearly 40 years later. So the marketing stunt definitely seems to have worked. Should have continued on with it. However, new management of Games Workshop would take over, and the professional working arrangement between the band and the company and the label would all sort of fade and go to the wayside. Boltthrower would continue to write about Warhammer themes and even use some very, very Warhammer themed art going forward. But the contract, by which all accounts is a very informal deal, you know, not a handshake deal informal, but like one step above that, stipulated that it was a 13-year deal for Boltthrower Earache to use Games Workshop's copyrighted material. Thus, 13 years later in 2002, the contract would need to be renegotiated. However, 2002 Games Workshop was a much different company than the one who originally signed the contract back in 1989. They had no intent on re-signing this deal, presumably without some huge cash payment from the band and label, which by then, 2002, Boltthrower had actually left Earache Records years previously, and the relationship between the band and label had soured tremendously. So, in my mind, right, Earache probably had no interest in forking over cash for it. Games Workshop wanted money for it, so the deal died there. Thus, in 2005, Earache would re-release Realms of Chaos, but they had to get new artwork done. It was actually by the same guy who made the original artwork there, but they had to change it to be similar, but just different enough to skirt copyright law. You know what I'm talking about here, boys. Now, the band has said that they don't receive any royalties from this re-release, nor were they even contacted or, you know, notified about it. So look it up to them. It's on the website. But I guess we could say that the deal between Games Workshop and Boltthrower officially ended in 2002. Now, it's kind of weird to me, right? The album art for War Master and Honor, Valor, Pride, very, very, very Warhammer themed. So maybe Games Workshop saw that and didn't really feel the need to continue to this deal. Or maybe by the release of their second album, War Master, which is like another Warhammer reference, maybe Games Workshop wanted money from Earache to use sort of their art and they didn't want to pay. I don't know. You know, there's so many things that are just left unsaid, and probably only people who know are like the Earache labels themselves and the Games Workshop management. But thus comes to the end of the story of one of the most legendary collaborations between a corporation and a death metal band probably ever. Entirely unique in the history of metal. You know, basically nothing else has really ever come close to having such a legendary aura other than Boltthrower's Warhammer 40k themed album, right? To me, the music of Boltthrower, especially this more grindy influence, really sort of raw death metal style, just sounds like Warhammer 40k to me, right? Realms of Chaos, the album, just sounds like 40k to me. It's grimy, it's dark, it's pummeling, it's unrelenting. Carl Willett's vocal sounds like a corn grater demon shouting at you. You know, when I listen to this album, this is the music that I picture Noise Marines just blasting and listening to. Just maximum stimulation, blast beats everywhere, crazy, crazy low, muddy, greasy guitars. It's just so perfect for Warhammer 40k. I just love it. A collaboration made in hell and released onto us, and for us to enjoy all these years later. It still remains a great album. Warhammer 40k is still going strong. And yeah, like I said, you know, this marketing stunt, I really did think it worked out quite well for Games Workshop. I'm sure more than a few people, more than me, have been sort of introduced to the band or to the product, you know, back and forth over the years just through this connection. It's really, really interesting. And it probably would never ever work again, but I feel like they could have maybe done this again with Boltthrower later on. But I know, you know, companies, money, contracts, legality, all that fun stuff. So boys, let me know down below what you guys think of this. Do you guys play Warhammer? Did you know about this? Do you like Boltthrower? You know, leave it down in the comments here, boys. Make sure to like the video. Stay tuned for that one and all the Warhammer references and Boltthrower. I've been Varvis. Thank you for watching, guys. Cheers.